Hello everyone, Matt here. In this video we're going to talk about fallacies. I'm going to give you an introduction to what a fallacy is and give you some examples, and then we'll talk about the two main kinds of fallacies. So first, we're going to follow Hurley's definition of fallacy and concise introduction to logic. We have the definition right here. You can see a fallacy is a defect in an argument consisting in something other than a false premise. So if the only thing wrong with the argument is that it's got a false premise, according to this definition, then that argument does not contain a fallacy. So we could think about it in this way. In the very first chapter, we talked about what arguments are. Arguments have to meet two conditions in order for something to count as an argument. It has to meet these two conditions. One, you have to have an evidential claim, and two, you've got to have an inferential claim. The evidential claim is represented in the premises. These are the facts that are presented as evidence that give you the reasons to believe. And then the inferential claim is what those premises do. They're supposed to have this supporting relationship with the conclusion. Well, when we say that an argument has a fallacy, we're not saying that there's any problem with number one here. There's no problem with the evidential claim. The problem, rather, is with the inferential claim. So a fallacy is the name that we give to an argument that has a problem in the inferential claim. And arguments can go wrong in either way. You can have an argument with a false premise, and then we've got a problem with number one. Or you can have an argument that commits a fallacy, and then you've got a problem with number two. Either way, the argument is bad. The argument has gone wrong, so it's a bad argument. Or the argument could go wrong in both ways. It could have a false premise and have a bad inferential claim and thus commit a fallacy. So this is what a fallacy is. Now we're going to talk about the two main kinds of fallacies. Fallacies come in two different types. A formal fallacy is a fallacy that has a problem with the form of the argument. Now in a previous section, we talked about the counterexample method. And part of the counterexample method was isolating the form of the argument and then providing a counterexample to that argument's form. So when we were going through the counterexample method, we were actually detecting formal fallacies. We were proving that there was something wrong with the form of the argument. That's what we were doing with the counterexample method. So that's what formal fallacies are. Formal fallacies are just arguments that have a bad form or structure. And we were able to prove that with the counterexample method. When an argument commits an informal fallacy, on the other hand, there's nothing wrong with the form or the structure of the argument. Rather, there's something wrong with the content of the argument. So now let's look at some examples. So here's an example of an argument, a bad argument. For those of you who don't know about Fresno State and PC, Porterville College, their mascot is the pirate. Fresno State's mascot is not a pirate. So this one has a false premise. The second premise is false. But there's nothing wrong with the form, there's nothing wrong with the structure, there's nothing wrong with the inferential claim here. This is actually a valid argument, but we've got a false premise. So according to the definition that we're going to be using, this one does not contain a fallacy, because the only thing wrong with it is that it's got a false premise. The inferential claim is fine, so there's no fallacy here. Let's look at another example. Now, if you recall, the counterexample method, we saw this form of argumentation. This one I call the Hitler example because this one commits a formal fallacy, and it's a particular kind of formal fallacy called denying the antecedent. But don't worry about the name. Just think about if you were going to try to prove that this one was invalid, you could use the Hitler example. If Hitler was beheaded, then he's dead. Hitler was not beheaded, therefore Hitler's not dead. You don't even have to know who Shane is or what happened to Shane to know that this argument is not a good argument, because we saw this form before and we proved that it was invalid by isolating the form of the argument, if A then B, not A therefore not B, and then using the Hitler counterexample to prove that this one was invalid. So this one, both of the premises here are true. If you haven't seen The Walking Dead, the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. So whenever you have an argument that you know the premises are true and the conclusion is false, then you start to think automatically, all right, this one commits a fallacy. I just got to figure out what the fallacy is. In this case, it's a formal fallacy because we're able to isolate the form of the argument and prove that form is a bad form with the counterexample method. Think about this one too. We saw this form of argumentation as well when we were going over the counterexample method. This one also has a problem with the form of the argument. Both of the premises here are true, and the conclusion also is true. Bearded dragons are lizards. You can go to PetSmart and see a bearded dragon if you've never seen one. Okay, so where does this one go wrong? Well, the form of the argument is bad, so this one commits a formal fallacy. And we could isolate the form of the argument. All A are B, all C are B, therefore all A are C. And we can prove that this one is invalid by using any number of counterexamples that we might have gone over in a previous section. So for instance, all dogs are mammals, all cats are mammals, therefore all dogs are cats. That counterexample proves that this form is invalid. So this one also commits an informal fallacy. Now let's take a look at an argument that commits an informal fallacy. So the previous two arguments committed formal fallacies. This one commits an informal fallacy. The problem with this argument is with the content of the argument. And what I mean by the content are the terms or the statements themselves. So in this particular argument, the problem, some of my students have pointed out where there's a problem with number 2, but that atoms are actually visible because physical objects are made out of atoms and we see physical objects. So we're actually seeing the atoms of these. Well, go with it. Just think of particular individual atoms are not visible to the naked eye. So cars are composed of atoms, that's true. Atoms are not visible to the naked eye. That's what we mean by invisible. Therefore, my car is invisible. Well, since there's nothing wrong with the form, and you know that the conclusion is false, and these premises are true, then there's got to be something wrong with the content of the argument. And the problem is this particular fallacy is one of the named fallacies that we're going to go over in later sections. This one's called the fallacy of composition. So just because there's some property or attribute of the parts that something's made up of, doesn't mean that that property or attribute goes to the whole that is made up of those parts. Just so you know that this one is not a formal fallacy, it's an informal fallacy. There's something wrong with the content of the argument. Here's another informal fallacy. There's something wrong with the terms that are used in this argument. In this one, we're shifting meaning from one premise to the next. So what we mean by bank in this premise is not the same thing as what we mean by bank in this premise. And so this fallacy is called equivocation because we're shifting meaning from one premise to the next of that key term, because the conclusion depends on the meaning of that term. So this one also commits an informal fallacy. Okay, so that is an introduction to fallacies and the two main kinds of fallacies. I've given you some examples. That has been the introduction to fallacies.